I remember when my wife and I were in Australia at this time of the year trying to celebrate Thanksgiving and to find anything that had turkey in it. It was quite a challenge, but we finally managed to do it, believe it or not. This holiday in November, a unique American holiday. And as a child, as I suspect was true for many of you, I really loved Thanksgiving. It was the one time we gathered together at my grandmother Sammons' house. I seldom was there during the year because my grandmother, who was sort of like a prototype of Whistler's mother, liked to be alone with her housekeeper and to keep her own company. My father would go over after dinner every night and stoke the furnace and say hello to his mother and how are you doing, and then he'd come home. But Thanksgiving was a time when we all got together in her house, she in her rocking chair and the rest of us playing with board games and singing songs. Looking back, I'm thankful not only for the meal we had that day with the dining room table just heaped high with all of those luscious traditional Thanksgiving foods and listening to Caruso on my grandmother's gramophone with its wind-up handle and its big horn coming out at us. My father's room up in the attic had been kept the way it was when he went off to college. And I loved going up there and looking at the pictures of my father on the wall as a football player, something I wanted to do someday when I got older and, believe it or not, was able to do, just like my father did. During school that week before Thanksgiving, kids in my generation always either heard or acted out the famous myth about Thanksgiving, with the Indians invited to dinner as an expression of thanks for the help they'd given the Pilgrims. Well, all that help wasn't voluntary. If you have really read the story of the coming of the Pilgrims, you know that that first winter when they were having trouble feeding themselves, they invaded the Indians' cache of buried corn and took it for themselves, just like eventually they took the land from these native people, believing that the king had given them the right to settle wherever they wanted in this terra incognito, which meant land without civilized people. In spite of how good that cleaned-up story of the Pilgrims' Thanksgiving was, it took a long time for Thanksgiving to be recognized as a national holiday. It was just celebrated in bits and pieces in various parts of the country. It wasn't until the midst of the Civil War that was tearing the country apart with the loss of thousands and thousands of lives that Sarah Josepha Hale, who was the editor of Goody's Ladies' Book, well, not so funny, it really was a popular publication of its time, wrote to President Lincoln. And she urged him to declare Thanksgiving a national holiday, believing that we needed a celebration to pick up our national spirit in the midst of that horrible war. So Lincoln asked his Secretary of State, William Seward, to write a proclamation for him, which he did. And in part it read like this: "The year that is drawing towards its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and beautiful skies. To these bounties, which are so consistently enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften the heart, which is habitually made insensible to the ever-watchful providence of the Almighty God. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and provoke their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained everywhere, the laws have been respected and obeyed, except in those areas of armed conflict, and harmony has prevailed, except in those areas. And the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect a continuance of years with a large increase of freedom. That is, freedom once the war was ended. So I do invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States and those who are at sea or dwelling in foreign lands to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. And I recommend to them that while offering up their ascriptions justly due to him for such singular perseverance, that they commend to his tender care all those who have become widows and orphans, mourners or sufferers in the lamentable strife of which we're now engaged, and fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation and restore it to peace, when it is consistent with the divine purpose to have us enjoy that. You know, what Lincoln was asking people to remember, along with all that disturbed them, was that they still had much to be thankful for as they longed for an end to a terrible war and a return to a more peaceful way of life. And each American president since, every year, has issued a similar proclamation, because there are always things that trouble us, and there are always reasons to give thanks for the blessing of being alive and existing in what is still a beautiful and bountiful world in spite of all the terrible things that we human beings have been doing to it. The proclamation or not, it's not always easy to feel thankful. I thought of this last month when, like many of you, experienced the electricity being shut off in our house. A movie with Eddie Murphy disappeared. Boom! The screen just went blank, and everything else in the house run by electricity just stopped running. And you know how much stuff in our house is run by electricity? An awful lot. You don't recognize it until the electricity's gone. So we got out extra blankets, got ready for bed with flashlights and lanterns. We put our food in ice chests or gave it away, and we went to bed and got extra blankets and snuggled in. Waking up the next morning, pretty warm with all of those blankets and quilts on top, I just resumed reading a book I'd been enjoying, and I did some yard work to get exercise. I'm a pruning freak. I like to go out and do that. And I told my wife I liked how quiet the house had become. It seemed very peaceful. But the next day, when I woke up, after another many hours without electricity, I didn't feel so sanguine. We still had food in the coolers, and we even had dinner by candlelight, which should have seemed romantic. But fires were still raging all over California. The wind was howling, and even an extra quilt on the bed didn't make me feel any better. The next morning, when we woke up, still without electricity and no promise of when it would return, our house now felt as though it were dead, drained of the lifeblood that electricity is. Our house wasn't like my grandmother's, with its coal furnace and a wood-burning stove in the kitchen and fixtures that were still in place to get gas to light up the house. But our house, unlike my grandmother's house, no longer felt alive. But, you know, boom, the electricity eventually came back on. Life returned to the way it had been before. I discovered that if losing electricity for a couple of days caused me to turn from feeling peaceful to feeling glum, what about those people Lincoln was talking about? We're facing this horrible war. I think Lincoln was trying to tell the people of America that being thankful should not just be dependent on the good things that are around us. Being thankful, I think he was trying to communicate, is a matter of attitude, an attitude about whether life is worth it or not. And in Lincoln's judgment, it was. and for me it is too. I've faced far worse things in my life than the loss of electricity, but I've always found after it's passed that life is worth it. I'm aware of my social location, and I've tried not to exploit it, but I've enjoyed a good life because I was born into a good family that waited luckily through the Depression to conceive me. My parents were caring people who provided their children with a secure home. My father had worked his way up from being a traveling salesman to owning a company in which he worked, but we didn't live like people with a lot of money. The garbage man lived right across the street, and it was a fairly humble house we lived in. My father didn't have much more money for our house because he supported not only his family, like his widowed mother, but also my mother's parents, after my mother's father had gone bankrupt during the Depression, and my grandparents had lost their home along with my grandfather's job. But there were children to take care of in our family, 4 of us. And my brothers, having gone off to college, one on an academic scholarship, the other on a scholarship as an athlete, it was my turn. And because my father had saved all that money with my other brothers, he was able to pay the tuition for me to go to a good school. I got a chance to go to that school and worked hard, and I got good grades, and it gave me a chance to look for a profession which I would find satisfying. It took a while. It took going to one graduate school and quitting and then going to another, but after a while I discovered that a friend at work who invited me to his church on a Sunday had invited me into a blessing. The Third Unitarian Church of Chicago, where he went and I finally joined, was a place where people could be themselves and learn from each other, a group of people of immense diversity. And I decided that I wanted to work in that kind of setting. So I went off to seminary, and when that one didn't work, I found out about our UU school here in Berkeley, a school which could teach me how to be a minister, not just about all the stuff of religion. And I was blessed with that education. It was really right for me. And in the end, it gave me the opportunity to find a job as the assistant minister of what was then one of the largest UU congregations in the country in Rochester, New York, and I learned a lot there too. Then I went on to be a minister in Cincinnati, where I grew up as a minister, even though I went through the agony of divorce, because you see, I found a wonderful woman to whom I've now been married for over 4 decades, and am blessed by that marriage more than I could ever describe. I've also been blessed with 5 children and 7 grandchildren, another blessing, even though some of those children have had real challenges, and I found that just because you've entered into your 8th decade of life doesn't mean you stop being a parent or your children stop needing you. But I've needed them too. I've needed their love, and I've needed their own giving birth to children, some of them, which gives the delight of grandchildren, so that now, even though I'm as old as I am, I still have one that's about that big, you know. And my wife gets to go babysit with our 2 grandchildren who now live in Alameda. During this journey, I'm also thankful for some attributes of my own, like an active curiosity, an adventuresome spirit, a willingness to think a lot, to do things that need to be done and not just let life pass me by. I'm thankful for acquiring a sense of responsibility from my father, so that I've been able to provide a good home for my own family, even here in the expensive Bay Area. And I'm thankful for a desire to continue to learn and to do what's necessary to improve myself both personally and professionally. I'm thankful for acquiring a sense of social responsibility and seeing that as essential to my religious faith. I learned this from my aunt, my good Aunt Beulah, who worshiped often in the modest black Methodist church down by the tracks in my hometown, rather than going to the big, expensive Methodist church on top of the hill with its campus that covered almost a block. I got to ride in a taxi with my aunt, who was the town librarian during the Second World War years, when she put her car up on blocks so my brothers could have her gas ration coupons to continue their social lives. She took me to all the museums in the city, and then she taught me how to use streetcars and the train to get to them all by myself. I'm also thankful for getting through some things like a couple of accidents that could have taken my life, and if luck would have had it, would have taken them. I'm thankful for a decision to end a marriage that seemed doomed to unhappiness, to free both my former wife and I to find new ways in life for ourselves. I'm thankful for leaving a seminary where I wasn't learning what I needed to learn in terms of being a minister, and then finding one where I could. I'm thankful for listening to people who cared about me and gave me good advice, including some advice that was rather painful to hear. I'm grateful for a fifth grade teacher who showed me that reading could be fun instead of something I refused to do in spite of my aunt being the town librarian. Actually, I could add a lot of other people to whom I owe thanks for what they shared with me in my life, especially my wife, who keeps teaching me things I need to learn. I'm also thankful for keeping at ministry, even when there were people who would have preferred to have someone else standing here in this pulpit, because they needed to be ministered to just as much as people who really liked me. To be a minister, you've got to be a minister to everyone, no matter what they feel about you. Over the years since I first read him, I've tried to follow the advice of our Unitarian sage, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who began his professional life as a minister. He advised people to cultivate the habit of being grateful for every good thing that comes to you and to give thanks continually. He said, and because all things have contributed to your advancement, you should include all things in your gratitude, including things which were rather painful to experience. I've tried to listen to that, and I've tried to listen to Robert Boileau, who is a more contemporary theologian, who says it's not just the big things in our lives for which we should be thankful, but even the little things. Because if you look back, sometimes those little things turned out to be the things that really mattered. Viktor Frankl was imprisoned in a Nazi death camp during the Second World War. It was a horrible place with people being sent to the gas chamber every day. And he reflected on what kept him going. And he said what kept him going was a belief that the last of our freedoms is to choose our attitude in every given circumstance. And the attitude he chose to adopt was to think about the love that he had shared with his wife, the love he still felt in that horrible place. Henry Edberg suggests that being thankful for what we have rather than being sad about what we don't have is the easiest way to lift our moods, to give our motivation a lift and to live a happier life, no matter where we are or who we are, and no matter what's going on in life. And even when it feels like nothing in life can be going right, like all those days in a row where something seems to go wrong, we can at least find some little pleasure, some fleeting moment, some small act of kindness for which we can be grateful. When feeling down, Enberg says we should look around ourselves and find people or things for which we're actually thankful, and we should let others know about it, not just keep it to ourselves, because that'll make their lives happier, and it will give us a sense of being generous persons, gracious people. And we should think about those things about ourselves for which we should be thankful, and if they don't come easily to mind, we should ask someone else what they see in us for which they're thankful. And you may be surprised that the things that people come back to you with may not be big achievements. Others may appreciate that you're a good listener, you have a sense of humor, you're willing to give a helping hand, you just look them in the eye when you're talking with them. But what about all those not nice things that are around us? And boy, sometimes it seems like they can be overwhelming. Like, I've gone to Central America several times because I wanted to see what life was really like for these people who were trying to get a better life by coming to this country. And when I was going, our tax dollars were financing wars that was making life miserable for the people who lived in those countries. And the amazing thing is that the people I found in those countries were unwilling to just be miserable about their fate. Who really wants to be miserable deep down? I found people being grateful for having family and friends who cared about them, being able to sing songs of rejoicing on Sunday morning when they gathered together for communion. I found them being thankful for having a meager roof over their heads and some food to eat, even though both things were things which none of us would be comfortable living here in as affluent a place as we do. Our attitudes matter. And I'm not talking here about people with critical clinical problems who require a lot more than just the words of a sermon. I'm talking about most of us. Those of us who can choose to not let the dark clouds, which are always up there over our head, and we're praying for some now and some rain, when those dark clouds come our way. And the clouds pass. Bad things happen and then they're over. And we have a chance to go on. PG&E turns off the lights and then they turn them back on. There's a fire and it burns out, or an earthquake and it ends. I remember standing in a little office building over there in '89 when that terrible earthquake happened, and not even knowing that later on that month I would meet a woman who was in a car when the top of the freeway fell down on her, and she had gone through surgery to survive. But it passed, and what she was talking with me about was her wedding, which was coming up in another month or two. People get through things, even stressful things, and they're able to think about what they can be thankful for, and they can realize that life means to be good even when bad things happen, when it throws a wrench in our way. William Penn once said, "The secret to happiness is to count your blessings while others are adding up their troubles," and I think he was right. So let me close now with some words from one of my favorite poets, May Sarton. It's from her book, Coming into 80, which I've now done. They remind me of what I felt like growing up in the more changeable climate of the Midwest, there in my grandma's house. She wrote, "When memory keeps fresh frames unspoken, I catch for you innumerable friends. When so much else had been destroyed or broken, these joys remain intact as the year ends. A year of earth grief and bitter news, the starving children and burning trees, otters coated in oil and dolphins drowned, Small joys keep life alive. I give you these. They won't die, you know. They stay around. When the long winter lingered on and all the color stayed on ugly brown, suddenly snowdrops had pushed their way through, and their sharp whiteness made everything new. Early in February, owls began to woo, and their language gentle calling, hoo, hoo, hoo. And I was lit up when an enormous bird in the harsh cold spoke a tender word. The finches changed their suits this year from olive to bright gold, and there were burbling as always, these birds, their busy flight a whirl of yellow weaving through the static air. The daffodils in April thronged the grass, and all along the wood's edge, fabulous to show the thousand faces of a nation, expected still beyond expectation. Later in June, alive with silent fire, the fireflies pulsed their firefly desire, and from the distance I could watch the dance and follow the bliss. It only happened once during the year. Full summer brought nasturtiums in profusion. I picked and bent to drink the sweet confusion. Yellow and orange, the sweet scent. I could keep summer in a bowl for days. And one autumn night, my cat ran to my call and leapt over 5 feet of a terrace wall. A second, weightless, he flowed and didn't fall. That silver splendor, princely and casual. And last I give you murmur of waves breaking, the sound of sleep that is kind of waking, as the tide rises from the distant ocean and is still and yet in motion. The small joys last and even outlast earthquake and fire. I give you these for love and for hope's sake, and this I do. Amen.